Okay.
Welcome to Founders Raw. Cheers.
Thank you. Cheers.
Yeah. What I find really interesting about your background is that you were an entrepreneur and now you're on the other side as a investor in the venture business. So, what led you to start your first company? And then secondly, what made you, or what was the decision to take you onto a different direction?
Sure. So, hubris. I had been at a company where I was one of the first employees, and we got public 2.5 years after the company was started, and I thought, well, wow.
Hey.
This is easy. Anybody can do this. So, and also, I like the notion of being able to control my own destiny.
Yeah.
I was a big believer I came from an entrepreneurial family, and I was a big believer growing up of always bet on yourself.
Yeah. So you're saying your father was an entrepreneur?
My father was an entrepreneur. My grandfather was an entrepreneur.
Oh, geez, yeah.
So it was one of those, been at a successful startup in terms of the liquidity, and had changed an industry, right? We introduced online payments essentially before people knew what online payments were. So I liked that feeling of being able to really innovate and do something new. And when you couple that with wanting to control my own destiny and coming from an entrepreneurial family, and as I said, a bit of hubris, thinking, wow, well, anybody can raise money. And it turned out actually at that time in the mid 90s, it wasn't that tough to raise money as long as you had a good idea and a team that people thought could execute on that idea. So it was a phenomenal experience, and I had got to have both a success and a failure, and in some ways learned far more in the failure than I did in the success. And I think in part because of that failure and because of my experience with my investors and what I expected out of them, that really got me thinking about, if I were an investor, what would I do?
Yeah.
Right? Because you're sitting there and you're looking at your investor across the table and you're like, well, geez, I really need you to do this for me.
Yeah.
And I started thinking, well, if I have to keep asking and these guys don't innately understand this, I'm probably missing a bunch of stuff anyhow because I don't know what they can do for me. So I started thinking about starting a venture fund much like I thought about a startup.
Yeah.
Right? There's some pain in the market. How we wanted to have our culture of our firm, what areas we wanted to invest in because we saw opportunities that other people weren't tapping into, et cetera. So starting a venture fund for me was no different than starting a company. It's just that it wasn't an operating company, and when you started it, and no one told me this, but I've now learned to learn it well and love it, is that a venture fund is you start it and you're with it for a long time. There's no shutting it down, so to speak.
No, you're running it 10 plus years just on one fund.
Because you have the responsibility of the entrepreneurs.
Exactly.
Right? You can't put money in somebody and then all of a sudden say, well, I'm done, I'm going to walk away.
Yeah.
That doesn't work.
No.
So that's how I crossed over, so to speak, and it's been just like for any startup, I learned something new every day.
So what are the similarities and the differences between the two? There's obviously similarities, but there's obviously...
Well, let me start with the difference. I think the biggest one is that you're not running the company as a venture capitalist, right? There is a difference between being an investor and an operator. And you cannot walk in and start trying to dictate how the company's run. That is just, that right there is a non-starter for...
Exactly.
An entrepreneur shouldn't take an investor like that. So you have to learn how to influence without trying to dictate. You have to learn how to build your relationship in a way with the entrepreneur and the senior management team where they view you as a resource and they utilize you, and you give them your best advice.
Yeah.
And as an entrepreneur, the buck stops with you, and you take the reins, and you've got to make decisions and drive things. And so one is less about patience and more about action, and the other one's that's as an entrepreneur, and as a VC, you have to be more patient, and sometimes it's less about action and more about letting time march on. So, but where the similarities are, you still have to have some vision of a market. You have to see opportunity. You have to see where the holes are. You still have to be willing to take risk. And ultimately, you still have to be great at building relationships, because that's what being a great entrepreneur is about, as well as being a great VC is about. In our book, is building those relationships. So there are times where I will go and sit in meetings, and I'll spend an hour and a half a meeting to really only get one tiny thing accomplished, and that may be to get the next meeting or set up one of our entrepreneurs to get a meeting with the person. And that skill set's the same. If you're a CEO, you'll go through a lot of awkward meetings to get to the right meeting sometimes.
For sure.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, it's like,
Yeah.
Then, it's like after 7 steps, then it's like, oh, it's the right
That's the right person.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that doesn't change at all.
What do you look for in entrepreneurs that you eventually fund?
So I think the first thing we look for, or I look for, is someone who understands their customer better than the customer understands themselves.
Yeah.
Right. You can get a lot of people who tell you, this is what I want as a customer, but the trick is knowing what they actually need. And so an entrepreneur who knows that customer so well, they can say this is what they really need, or they know that market so well, this is what they really need. That's it, right? That's the first thing. And then after that, there's the litany of things that we all expect, right? Somebody who wants to change the world.
Yeah.
And their reason for changing the world is because they see this opportunity to really improve the way things are done. We look for people who want a great relationship with their investor, in the sense that, if they want just dumb money, or they want somebody to show up and look at their financials and give them their opinion and walk away and they kind of listen to it, that's not really great, because I think everybody needs to surround themselves with people that can give them guidance, right?
Yeah.
And whether it's mentors or advisors or investors, we want people who are willing to make a tough decision, but willing to seek out advice before they make that decision. So.
And what are your thoughts on like first-time founders versus someone that has done this before?
I have the good fortune of being an adjunct professor and teaching students about entrepreneurship. And one of the things I tell them
at UW?
At University of Michigan.
Oh, okay.
So one of the things that I tell all of my students is, you don't necessarily have to go start a company right out of school. You may be better off going and working for a startup for a while, because you get to learn on somebody else's dime.
Absolutely.
You get to learn a lot of the lessons. So I don't mind first-time CEOs. But if you haven't been in an entrepreneurial environment, that's a little scary to me, because that can only be learned through experience. You can't read about it. Somebody can't tell you about it unless you've lived and breathed it. So we're fine with first-time entrepreneurs as long as they've been through an entrepreneurial organization.
Yeah.
So that's if they don't have that, that's a non-starter for us.
And so what else? What else that maybe? What comes out of the first meetings? And it sounds like you also you value relationship, right? So you might know this entrepreneur for 5 to 10 years before you actually make an investment. But what is it? Maybe that first contact that you're like, man, that guy's got it.
Yeah, I think one of the things that always catches my attention is how much care they take in the steps leading up to the meeting and then the meeting itself. Did they prepare for the meeting? I mean, literally, if they ask me, they walk into a meeting and they say, "So what do you invest in?" Like, okay, this meeting needs to be over fast, right? If you don't know what I invest in and what I'm looking for, it's not tough to figure out. Then it's sort of, again, those are kinds of things that are non-starters. So I look for more red flags than anything else.
Interesting, yeah.
It's stuff that tells me this person's not conscientious. This person is not thinking through that this is, not a one and done kind of meeting. This is, I want somebody who's coming in and demonstrating, look, I want to build a relationship, and it's a two-way street.
Well, what's really interesting about that is what you're looking for is someone that is so particular in actually the details, but that's like one of the best. That's one of the best skills as an entrepreneur, right?
Yeah.
To literally do their homework, study the market, study their customer, which if they're pitching, you're their customer, or they're your customer. But to do the homework and look at the details, that's I think it's just ante to the table to actually
that's table stakes.
Table stakes for sure.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
it's interesting that that's actually what you are filtering in those meetings.
Right. I mean, I even put this out there on our website, which is, look, if you shoot me an email through LinkedIn or through our info email address, and I haven't met you and you haven't gotten an introduction, maybe I'll respond. But if you've done the work to get a warm introduction to me, I'll absolutely respond. And that's sort of that first bar. It just demonstrates that you've got the chops to figure out how to do that. That's a basic skill every entrepreneur needs anyhow. So that's part of that that key.
So going back to your entrepreneur days, did you find that you were naturally, you had these skills and kind of, or it was just
the first CEO of my first company really was he came out of Hollywood, believe it or not.
No way.
He was a manager for actors and bands. So he was the manager for Gene Hackman the year the guy did 7 movies, including Hoosiers, if you remember the movie Hoosiers. Yeah. And he was the manager for bands like Journey.
No.
Yeah. So he was incredibly particular about communication and the way you communicated and the way you followed up with people and what you said and did in a meeting. And he really ingrained in me that you can't take those interactions for granted. You've got to be deliberate in how you think about it. So for me, it was trained into me as this is how you have to act in networking and building relationships.
Yeah. And did you work really closely alongside him?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the first employees and my first job was actually writing code and managing one of our partners. And he brought me into a board meeting, and one of the board members said, "Well, Mark, what do you think about our relationship with these guys, with this company?" And I said, "Frankly, I can't believe we're putting our destiny in these guys' hands. They don't know what they're doing." And I was just answering honestly to a board member. I didn't know. And the next day, the CEO calls me up and he said, "I want you to be everywhere I go.
That's
you
awesome.
are going everywhere with me. You're sitting in every meeting with me, and I'm moving you, and you're going to sit right next to me in the office."
That's awesome.
So it was pure luck because I was dumb enough to shoot my mouth off in a board meeting.
Sometimes that's the way it works, right?
Yeah.
Interesting. So, I wanted to talk to you about, I think the state of fundraising and investment is really interesting right now. What are your thoughts on it? I mean, we have things like the Jobs Act and, the crowdfunding, but also I think AngelList is really interesting, and it's kind of coming in as I call it a black swan. I think it is the black swan of the industry. So what are your thoughts on that? I mean, in terms of let's just call it AngelList right now.
Right. So I think, again, I always boil it down to, some people call it quantitative investing. Some people call it the qualitative side. I think about it in terms of transactionally driven investors and relationship driven investors. And I think AngelList is amazing. And I think for entrepreneurs, it's going to be one of the greatest tools ever, potentially, through the pure fact that investors like to follow other investors. No one wants to be the first one. VCs, you've heard the jokes about lemmings, et cetera. Yeah. And it's still true even with angels and seed investors. So I think AngelList resolves a lot of those issues and gets people to be aware that there's a financing occurring. And so people want to pile in. And I think what some of the funds are doing, like Atlas Ventures has announced a crowdsourcing fund where they're going to take, I believe they're taking 10 angels and they're just going to, they have a fund and they're just going to back everything that those 10 angels do with $250,000 or $100,000, I don't know exactly what it is. And obviously Foundry Group announced the same kind of thing. They were the first, in fact, Foundry was the first. So I think AngelList is going to revolutionize things in a lot of ways for entrepreneurs, but at the same time, that falls under the category of transactionally driven investors.
Yeah.
And for us, I go back to what we talked about with why I became a VC. There's this group of venture capitalists who are still relationship driven. And I think a lot of the more experienced entrepreneurs who've been through it before, they already have a relationship with an investor that they trust and they want to go back to for the next time that they start something. And they might not have been a CEO, they might have been a senior exec, but they've continued to have that relationship, whether the prior company was a success or failure. And so as much as I think those things are going to innovate, I still think that there is an important space for the relationship investors, especially with the more experienced entrepreneurs. There's a story that I tell people that almost no one believes, which is, but you can fact check this. So there was only one venture investor in Microsoft, right? One of the bellwethers, right? I mean, obviously Seattle has Microsoft and Amazon and lots of other great companies, but Microsoft was the first, right? And the guy who invested in his name was David Marquardt. And David Marquardt lived in the Bay Area and used to fly up here on the weekends to play basketball with Ballmer and Gates and just hang out with them and build his relationship with them. And eventually they came to him and said, look, we don't really need to raise money, but we really like you and we'd like you to invest. And so he brought the team with their long hair and the whole shot and up to Silicon Valley into technology venture investors, TVI's offices. And in fact, the story goes that TVI's assistant who was sitting at the front desk saw these guys from Microsoft walking in, and she said to somebody, we're not going to invest in those guys, are we? And it turned out to be one of the single greatest venture investments ever. And it happened only because the relationship was built between Mark Howard and Gates and Ballmer and Paul Allen, and they wanted him in their deal. And if he hadn't built that relationship, it wouldn't have happened. So.
Man, that's amazing. What you're saying is, I think the more things change, the more things stay the same, which is basically like the quality of, money's money, but the quality of the people around will never go away.
That'll never go away.
It's more important actually today than, what are your thoughts on like Kickstarter and crowdfunding and just that whole entire movement?
I think Kickstarter is not just Kickstarter, but that model is going to bring a whole new set of eyes to solving certain problems. Kickstarter is fantastic because I've got a cool new idea that I want to get off the ground. It's a great way to validate that there's demand for it. And what greater way to validate that there's demand that people are actually willing to give you money to go build it.
Yeah.
Though that lets you get the first version out. You still have to scale.
Yeah.
Right? And if you can figure out how to build your money or build your company through bootstrapping and cash flow, then you'll never need another dime. But if you want to scale quickly, which tends to be what consumers demand nowadays, something like Kickstarter is great. There's the outlier projects like, David Arquette is going to go do a movie and he puts it out on Kickstarter or something like that. But for the real products, it is a great way to get started that you couldn't have done before because people just didn't used to back, VCs don't back some invention, some new widget shows up that it hasn't happened. So Kickstarter is great for stuff like that, but extend that now into, there's a government project where they've partnered up with some researchers from the University of Michigan to help them figure out what next areas of healthcare should receive research funding.
Interesting.
And they've created a Kickstarter-like platform to get the public at large to source the ideas for what research should be done, and then they put their ideas up, and then people can private individuals can come and give money to it. And the projects that receive the most money, the government will match that money and get the research kicked off.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So there is a crowdsourcing model that I don't think people have thought about that's very similar to Kickstarter, and what it's trying to do is attack the problems that are most important to the public at large in terms of healthcare. So that's a lot of fun.
Let's say, it's a early stage founder or someone that's like considering starting a company. He's sitting there like, I got this idea. What do you tell him? What's your first advice?
First advice is become absolutely maniacal about talking to people and absorbing information and gathering data and really making sure you have a ton of information at your fingertips to start shaping your thinking and track everything, gather everything, because when you're at that early stage, one of the most impressive things is somebody who really is dug into every depth of their market. And it's not necessarily go out and start building your product right away. In fact, some of the best product design is done if you're, for example, in software, is done if you can figure out how to test the behavior without ever actually writing a line of code.
Yeah.
There's a great story of a company called Aardvark that was bought by Google.
Yep.
They raised about $4 million, were bought by Google for $40 or $50 million. In the first 6 months of that company, they never wrote a single line of code.
That's awesome.
So they were just out gathering information and watching behavior and designing tests where they didn't have to write code, and they were maniacal about gathering it all. And then when they went to raise money, they walked in and the investor said, it was Dave Hornick from August, and he said, well, so why do you know this is going to work? And they go thunk, and they drop down all of this data and all this information.
Oh, he's probably like,
he was like, this has been deliberate. This wasn't lightning in a bottle. These guys were thoughtful about their product design. They were thoughtful about the market and the information. blew them away, and was like very quick to write the check from there.
What's interesting is that doesn't happen overnight, right? And we
No.
have a lot of like founders and people that think they want to start companies. They're trying to do it overnight. They think it's fashionable, but no, like you got to take months, if not longer, to do the steps that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Prepare.
And it doesn't take a lot of money to do that.
No. You can still do that when you have a full-time job.
Right.
Right?
The best tests of behavior for products is often the ones that don't require any capital. Because you have to be thoughtful, and you have to really boil it down to that one behavior you're looking for, whether it's B2B or consumer.
Yeah.
You're trying to test that behavior and see whether people care about performing that behavior, whether it's solving a pain or it's making them stronger, whatever it is. So,
what are you seeing with your CEOs of the companies you invest in that it's like the trait that you're very impressed in terms of how they're leading their team, and probably the growth companies? Is there anything that jumps out at you that you're like?
The ones that have done a really good job of owning the data themselves. And I don't mean that they have to go and produce all the models, but really understanding the metrics that drive their company. What are the dials and knobs they can turn? What are the levers they can pull? And understanding that when they turn that dial or knob or pull that lever, what it's going to do to their business model and to their business.
Yeah.
I think that's the first one. That means that you're incredibly thoughtful about what kind of business engine, what kind of business model you're forming. And then, of course, always, and this one should have been first, but always is the culture they're building with their team. And that really comes down to their basic leadership traits. And whether you're early on or you're in later growth stages, you've got to be deliberate about the culture you build, and you've got to be thoughtful about that. And there's no good cultures or bad cultures, just the ones that you either design or the ones that happen.
Yeah.
And the ones that you design, those companies tend to succeed, and the ones that just happen tend to slide to the right.
Do you think
slide
it
to the left.
starts from day one?
I think it starts from day one.
Yeah. Founders determining, and it's not just like here's the 5 things we believe. It's actually like the day-to-day interactions between the founders, how they treat each other, what is, it's just like the entire package, right?
Some of the best founders I've met, if you ask them to describe what their culture, the culture they want to build in their company is like, you get them spun up and it is a half an hour later and they're still talking about, and they want to do this, and this is how they want to manage employees on Friday afternoons, and this is how they want to, they want to set up their development team meetings, and this is why they want to do them then. I want to do them Fridays so that the team has the weekend to think about it, and instead of doing them on Monday mornings when it's typical. But just being thoughtful about things like that. And people where I ask, what do you want your culture to be like? And they say, well, I want committed people who work long hours.
No.
That's not a culture.
No.
Right? That's, so you can tell how thoughtful somebody is about it.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. Cool. Well, we're about done, so I appreciate it.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.